And it's that time again, another episode of Remote Instruction. All right, so last time we talked about FDR's first New Deal. Today we're going to look at the second New Deal. Now, what the second New Deal is it's going to really put the federal government squarely on the side of workers. The second New Deal is all about getting Americans back on their feet. The first New Deal is primarily about getting the country going again, getting the economy flowing, getting people spending money, getting people to trust banks, getting people to trust the economy. The second New Deal is about the average American, getting them stabilized again. Now, the second New Deal is also FDR's real big push to try to steal Huey Long's thunder. Remember, we talked about Huey Long and his share of the wealth society, his whole plan of giving a universal basic income, of capping the amount of money people could make, and also of providing people with cars and televisions. So what this is this is FDR really trying to stretch himself a little more and do more than what the first New Deal does. So his primary goal here is to try to bring about security and to change the federal government's relationship with the people. What he's doing is he's trying to create a safety net so people feel safe within the government. Now, the second New Deal is what is really going, when most people think about the New Deal, this is what they think about. This is when you see the federal government growing in size. This is when the federal government becomes more recognizable to what we think of when we think of federal power and what the national government can and can't do. So this is going to be a really big expansion of power. This is when the New Deal makes a big shift away from the side of big business and starts to look towards the average American. So you're going to try to improve the relationships between industry and labor. You're going to try to provide regulation of the stock market. It's going to establish economic safety nets, and it's going to try to help people restore their faith in democracy. So one of the really big programs that is going to come out of the second New Deal Congress is going to pass is known as the WPA, or the Works Progress Administration. Now, the WPA is going to make the federal government the nation's largest employer. The WPA is often sometimes confused with the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, but the WPA, what it is it's a government agency that provided jobs for people in the New Deal. And it makes the national government the largest employer in the nation. They hired an average of 2 million people over about 4 years. By the end of it, about 25% of the country is going to be on the WPA's payroll. And they did a whole bunch of stuff. The WPA built airports such as New York's LaGuardia Airport. So if you've ever visited New York City and you've flown into LaGuardia, WPA, you have them to thank for that airport. They also restored St. Louis's riverfront area. They helped kind of bring up the bankrupted city of Key West, Florida, and make it a place where people would want to go. They also employed people to basically do anything to get a paycheck. So the WPA hired writers, artists, actors, musicians, and cultural programs. They had the Federal Theater Project, Federal Art Project, the Federal Music Project, the Federal Writers Project. So what they would do is they would hire talented people to create art, to create music, to do anything for the federal government. If you ever visit the campus of Louisiana State University, LSU, all throughout a lot of their academic buildings, they have these really big murals. And those murals were actually painted by the WPA. Now, as part of the WPA, they also had programs for youth. And a part of the WPA was a program called the National Youth Administration, or the NYA. And what they did is it provided part-time employment for students, and it helped jobless youth get jobs. 2 future presidents are going to get involved in these programs and benefit from them. One is going to be 27-year-old LBJ, or Lyndon B. Johnson. Excuse me. And he's going to be a part of a program in Texas. Another is Richard Nixon, a law student at the time at Duke University. And he's going to end up getting a job where he's going to work for a whopping 35 cents an hour. So somewhere between 1935 through 1943, the WPA is going to put and help some 9 million Americans find work. So WPA is a really big program as part of the Second New Deal. Another thing is the Wagner Act. And this is one of the most important pieces of labor legislation ever passed in American history. What it does is it guaranteed workers the right to unionize and to bargain with management about wages and other working issues. It prohibited employers from interfering with union activities. It also created the National Labor Relations Board to oversee union activities across the nation. They supervised union elections. They outlawed unfair business practices like blacklisting that we talked about when we talked about the Gilded Age and the striking movement, and also firing of labor union leaders. It threatened fines and jail time for businesses that refused to recognize labor unions. It protected workers' jobs, and it also helped raise their wages. So this was a way that it's an act that really kind of helped increase American purchasing power and helped put money in people's pockets. This was also really beneficial for workers in the South. And so this helps put more people back into spending more money for the government. Now, the next other piece of legislation we need to talk about is something called the Social Security Act, which I'm sure everybody has heard of. It's passed in 1935. And what it is legislation that was enacted to provide federal assistance to retired workers through a tax-funded pension plan that offered benefit payments to the unemployed and disabled. So the Great Depression really hits the oldest Americans and those with disabilities especially hard. And so what FDR wanted Congress to do is he wanted them to address the problems faced by old people and people with disabilities. And so what he did is he looked at it and he realized, the older people in society are the people who oftentimes they have extra medical expenses. They have to see doctors more, they get sick more easily, they have other types of issues that pop up later in life. And so what he wanted to do is he wanted to establish kind of a safety net to help cover the extra cost that people see once they age. And so what this is designed to do originally, it was designed to supplement income. It was never designed for people to live off of. It was never designed for people's only retirement savings. It was designed to help supplement income. And so what it does is it provided Americans with a check to help keep them afloat as they age. Now keep in mind, when this was passed in 1935, people did not retire. Retirement is a fairly new concept. It's kind of hard for us to understand how new that concept is. But literally in the 1930s, 1940s, and some into the 1950s, people literally worked until they died. Retirement is fairly new. And so this is designed, people were still going to work, and they're still also going to receive money. Or if they're unable to work, this was kind of a way to help kind of cover some of their additional cost. Now, this program started at $40 a month. So it gave Americans $40 a month if they qualified, and you had to be over the age of 65 to qualify. Now, the other thing about this is this was not given to everybody. The government limited who was entitled to these benefits. So if you were a domestic worker or you were a farm worker, then you're excluded. Now, a domestic worker means anyone who's like a maid or a cook, anyone who's self-employed. And this is a racist thing that was put into the Social Security Act, because typically most black workers in the 1930s are domestic workers. And so it excludes African Americans from being able to receive this entitlement. So because they were not allowed to receive Social Security, they were then told that they needed to look for welfare, which had a stigma, so it was stigmatized to it. Social Security was seen as an entitlement that was given to working Americans. All right. So, moving right along, the next thing that Congress is going to do is going to establish the Fair Labor Standards Act. And basically what this does is this builds on the Wagner Act. It established a minimum wage of a whopping 25 cents an hour. It also established a maximum work week of 40 hours a week. So this is how we get the typical standard work week is 40 hours. It comes from the Fair Labor Standard Act. Now, this affects a lot of people. In addition to doing the things that are on the screen here, it also abolished child labor, but it really transforms the South even more than the Wagner Act does, because it helps make the South consumers. It helps put a little more money in their pocket so they can go and buy things and help stimulate the economy even more. Now, we've talked about some of the critics that FDR encountered with the New Deal, but we need to talk about something else that's kind of a big kind of black spot on FDR's administration. And that's after he won re-election in 1936. He wins again in a landslide. And what he does in his second inaugural address, he promised that he was going to provide even greater reforms than he has already established with the New Deal. And what he does is he started to realize that there was something that was standing in his way. And what was standing in his way was the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was very conservative at this time, and it ruled several pieces of legislation that he saw as a cornerstone of his relief and reform and recovery efforts as unconstitutional. You know, we saw the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and the NRA, the National Association, the Act. So he says, you know, we can't keep having the court rule these things unconstitutional. And so what he wanted to do is, under the Constitution, it never said how many Supreme Court justices should sit on the court. Over the years, there were a lot of debates about how many justices should actually sit on the court at a given time. And typically, the number was 9. It gives you an odd number so you don't end up with hung votes. And so in 1937, you had 9 justices. In February of 1937, without consulting congressional leaders or even talking with his own advisors, FDR asked Congress to basically to approve for the admission of 6 new Supreme Court justices. And he explained that the aging justices on the court were falling behind in their work and they needed help. Now, what he really meant by that is they're not passing, they're not approving, they're not saying that my legislation is constitutional. The plan completely backfires on FDR. Opponents labeled his so-called court packing plan. They said it was too far political. One journalist says that FDR had become drunk with power. Democrats feared that the president was also seeking dangerous new powers. And it's one of FDR's biggest blunders. It's not his biggest. We're going to talk about his biggest disaster and his biggest problem that he has once he's president, and the worst thing he does when we talk about World War II and with Japanese internment. But what this does is it fractures the Democratic Party, and it also damages FDR's prestige. And the momentum he had from a lot of his landslide victories starts to kind of trail off with this. Now, just to summarize the big effect of the Second New Deal. The Second New Deal, and this is really important, so I'd write this down, star it, and just remember it. The Second New Deal shifts the debate of the question of whether the government should intervene to help the economy. And it makes people ask, how should the government intervene? So basically, the Second New Deal is why when there's a big economic problem, why people say, what should the government do? Before the New Deal, that question wasn't really entertained. The question was, well, should the government step in? But the Second New Deal changes that, and it says, yes, it is the government's responsibility to step in and try to fix it. And so the results of the New Deal are going to change every facet of American life. You're going to see definitions of liberalism change from limited government and free market economics to try to help use the government to help free people. And now what you see is in some cases, many people saw liberty and freedom to now mean that the government should help provide assistance to help create that liberty and freedom. So remember, very early in the class when we talked about freedom, when we talked about the questions, does freedom require more government or less government? This is when that question becomes a thing. So think about that as you're thinking about your theme papers. All right, y'all have an excellent rest of your day, afternoon, evening, whenever you're watching, listening to this. And I will catch you next time when we will talk about the Second World War.